The wind came as a predator, a relentless howl that stripped the plains bare and scoured the very memory of warmth from the land. It drove snow not in flakes, but in a solid, blinding sheet, a horizontal blizzard that erased the line between earth and sky. For Ethan, it was just another Tuesday in a long line of winters that tested a man's will to draw breath. His horse, Apollo, a sturdy buckskin that knew this land as well as he did, lowered its head and pushed through the gale, each step a hard-won victory against the storm's fury. The sun had surrendered hours ago, leaving only a bruised, violet glow on the western horizon, a light that was being steadily devoured by the encroaching dark. Ethan was a man carved from the same hard granite as the hills he called home. He lived in a state of quiet communion with solitude, finding more company in the cry of a hawk than in the chatter of a town. His face, weathered by sun and wind, was a map of lonely trails and silent thoughts. Words were a currency he spent sparingly. He was heading for the small, solid log cabin he'd built with his own 2 hands, a place tucked away in a fold of the hills where the wind's teeth were not quite so sharp. It was his fortress against the world, a world he had mostly turned his back on years ago. As he crested a low rise, the wind carried a new sound, a groaning, splintering noise that did not belong to the natural order of things. It was the sound of defeat. Through the maelstrom, he saw it, a dark, mangled shape against the unforgiving white. An overturned stagecoach. It lay on its side like a slaughtered beast, its wheels pointing uselessly at the churning sky. Ethan's jaw tightened. He nudged Apollo forward, his usual stoicism giving way to a grim sense of duty. The scene was one of frozen, violent stillness. 2 horses from the team lay dead in their harnesses, their bodies already disappearing under a shroud of drifting snow. The driver was slumped over the front axle, a statue of ice and regret. Ethan dismounted, his boots sinking deep into the snow, the cold biting at his legs through his thick woolen trousers. He checked the driver first. No pulse. The man's eyes were open, staring into the heart of the storm that had claimed him. Another man, a passenger by the looks of his fine city coat, was sprawled a few yards away, his face a pale, bloodless mask. He was gone, too. Ethan moved methodically, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He was preparing to ride on, to leave the dead to the winter and report it to the sheriff in Sage Creek when the snow thawed, when he saw a flicker of movement near the shattered door of the coach, a patch of white that was not snow trembled. He approached slowly, his hand resting on the colt at his hip out of pure instinct. It was a woman. She was curled into a tight ball, her body shaking with a violence that had nothing to do with the cold. A torn wedding veil clung to her hair, frosted with ice. Her dress, once a pristine white, was now a ruin of mud, snowmelt, and something darker that stained the lace around her hem. She was barefoot, her feet blue and raw against the frozen ground. He knelt, his knees cracking in the cold. "Ma'am?" His voice was a rough rasp, unused for most of the day. She didn't respond. Her eyes were closed, her face nearly translucent with cold. A trickle of blood had frozen on her temple, a stark crimson line against skin as pale as porcelain. He could see the faint, shallow rise and fall of her chest. She was alive, barely. There was no debate in his mind. Leaving her here was the same as killing her. With a low grunt, he gathered her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile bundle of bones and damp fabric. She moaned softly, a sound so faint the wind nearly stole it, but she did not wake. Carrying her was awkward. Her limp body offered no help. He struggled back to Apollo, the woman a dead weight against his chest. The horse shifted nervously, but stood its ground as Ethan heaved himself and his burden into the saddle. He wrapped his own thick coat around her as best he could, pulling her close against him, hoping his body heat could offer some small defense against the killing cold. He turned Apollo for home, leaving the wreck to be swallowed by the blizzard. The journey was slow, a grim procession through the howling darkness. The woman in his arms did not stir, her head lolling against his shoulder. He could feel the desperate, shuddering tremors that racked her body, a silent, frantic fight for life. He held her tighter, his own solitude feeling less like a choice and more like a cavernous, empty space that she had suddenly, unwillingly, fallen into. His cabin was more a shelter than a home, built for function, not comfort. A single room held everything he owned, a sturdy bed frame with a straw-ticked mattress in one corner, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and a massive stone hearth that dominated the opposite wall. It was here, before the fire, that he laid her down. He placed her on the bearskin rug he used on the coldest nights, her stillness a stark contrast to the roaring flames he soon had crackling in the fireplace. The firelight danced across her face, softening the harsh lines of her ordeal, and for the first time, Ethan allowed himself to truly look at her. She was young, younger than he'd first thought. Her hair, the color of dark honey, was a tangled mess of snow and twigs where the veil had torn away. Her features were fine, delicate, a face made for soft smiles, not for the grimace of pain it now wore, a painful beauty that felt out of place in his stark, lonely world. He felt a pang of something unfamiliar, an unwelcome stirring of protectiveness that he quickly shoved aside. She was a problem to be solved, a life to be saved. Nothing more. He worked with a quiet efficiency, his movements sure and practical. He found his sharpest knife and carefully cut away the sodden, ruined dress, which was stiffening with ice. Beneath it, she wore a simple cotton chemise. As he peeled the wet fabric from her shoulders, he saw them, dark, ugly bruises, blooming like poison flowers against her pale skin. They were round, the distinct shape of cruel fingers. He paused, his hands hovering above her, a cold anger coiling in his gut. These were not the marks of a stagecoach accident. He pushed the thought away and continued his work, wrapping her shivering form in his thickest wool blankets. He brought a basin of warm water and gently cleaned the cut on her temple and the blood from her feet. Her hands, when he took them to warm them by the fire, were clenched into tight fists. He had to pry them open. Her left hand drew his attention. The ring finger was raw and bloodied, the skin torn as if a ring had been ripped from it with brutal force. She mumbled something in her unconscious state, a wordless whimper of fear. He offered her nothing but silence, the crackle of the fire filling the space between them. He brewed a thin broth from dried jerky and herbs, and when she stirred again, he propped her head up and managed to get a few spoonfuls past her lips. She finally opened her eyes. They were a deep, startling blue, clouded with confusion and terror. They darted around the unfamiliar room, taking in the log walls, the rifle mounted over the mantelpiece, and finally, him. Fear tightened her features. "You're safe," he said, his voice low and steady. "You were in a wreck. I found you." Her eyes searched his face, looking for a threat. She tried to speak, but only a dry, rasping sound came out. She swallowed and tried again. My husband." "There were 2 other men. They didn't make it," Ethan said, his words blunt but not unkind. A strange look passed over her face. It was not grief, it was something else, something shuttered and unreadable. She nodded slowly, a single, jerky motion. "He's dead," she whispered, the words a flat statement of fact, devoid of emotion. She wouldn't explain how she knew, or why her voice carried no sorrow. He let the silence stretch. He was not a man to pry. "Trouble found you easy enough in this life without going out to look for it." "What's your name?" he asked, his tone gentle. She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the fire. The flames cast dancing shadows across her face, making it impossible to read her expression. For a long moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, so quietly he almost missed it, she spoke a single word. "Claire." Over the next few days, the blizzard did not relent. It imprisoned them in the small cabin, cutting them off completely from the outside world. The snow piled up against the door and crept halfway up the single window, plunging the room into a perpetual twilight. For Ethan, the storm was a familiar companion. For Claire, it was a cage. She remained a ghost in his home, a silent, withdrawn presence who moved with a skittish grace. She said nothing about the wreck, her husband, or how she came to be in a wedding dress in the middle of a Wyoming blizzard. Her silence was a fortress, and Ethan, a man who respected boundaries, did not try to breach its walls. He gave her his bed, taking the bearskin rug by the fire for himself. He cooked their meals, simple stews and pan-fried bacon, and they ate in a silence that was thick with unspoken questions. He was a man accustomed to solitude, but this was different. This was a shared silence, heavy and charged. Her presence was a constant, low hum beneath the surface of his quiet life, a disruption he could not ignore. He would be chopping wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe a familiar comfort, and he would feel her eyes on him from the window. He would be mending a piece of tack, his fingers nimble and sure, and he would glance up to find her watching him, her expression haunted and distant. He continued to notice things, small details that stitched together a troubling picture. She slept fitfully, often waking with a muffled cry, her body rigid with fear. He'd pretend to be asleep, listening to the ragged sound of her breathing as she fought her way back from whatever demons haunted her dreams. One afternoon, while she was staring out at the white wilderness, a small object fell from the pocket of the simple wool shirt he'd given her to wear. It was a small square of linen, a piece of a handkerchief perhaps. It was folded neatly, and in the corner, stitched in fine blue thread, were two initials, A.P. They were not her initials, nor, he suspected, those of the man she called her husband. He saw her snatch it up, her movements furtive and quick, and hide it away as if it were a guilty secret. The bruises on her shoulders began to fade, but the wounds inside her remained raw and open. She flinched from any hint of contact. If he passed her a plate of food and their fingers accidentally brushed, she would recoil as if she had been burned. He learned to keep his distance, to move slowly, to make no sudden movements. He was treating her like a spooked mare, a creature hurt by a cruel hand, and the realization soured in his stomach. Yet, for all her fear of touch, she watched him. Her gaze was intense, analytical, as if she were trying to dissect him, to understand the kind of man he was. He felt her eyes on his hands as he worked, on his back as he stared into the fire. It was a look that held a universe of pain, a deep, sorrowful questioning that made him profoundly uncomfortable. It was the look of someone who had forgotten what safety felt like. On the fourth night, the storm raged with a renewed fury, the wind shrieking like a banshee around the eaves of the cabin. The world had been reduced to the warm, flickering circle of light cast by the fire and a single tallow candle on the table. Ethan had made a thick venison stew, and the rich smell filled the small space. He set two bowls on the table, the simple, domestic act feeling strangely intimate in the oppressive silence. They ate. The only sounds, the scrape of spoons against wooden bowls and the howling of the wind. The candlelight softened the sharp angles of Ethan's face and cast deep shadows in the hollows of Claire's eyes. She barely touched her food, merely pushing the chunks of meat around her bowl. Ethan finished his meal and leaned back in his chair, watching the fire. He expected her to retreat to the bed as she usually did, to curl up under the blankets and disappear into herself. But tonight, she stayed at the table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The silence stretched, taut and fragile. He could feel a tension building in her, a pressure rising from some deep, hidden place. When she finally spoke, her voice was a raw, trembling whisper that cut through the noise of the storm. "Please." He turned his head slowly to look at her. Her face was pale in the candlelight, her eyes wide and shimmering with unshed tears. Her lips trembled as she formed the next words, each one a shard of glass. Just touch me once." The request hung in the air between them, shocking in its simplicity and devastating in its need. It was not a plea for passion, but for something far more fundamental: a confirmation. A simple human connection in a world that had seemingly offered her none. Ethan stared at her, utterly frozen. He did not understand. Every instinct she had shown him was one of recoil, of fear of his proximity. And now this. He saw the conflict warring in her eyes, the desperate yearning and the profound terror of that same desire. He didn't know what to do. His own life was built on the principle of not reaching out, of not getting involved. His hands, calloused and rough from a life of hard labor, felt like clumsy, useless things. Before he could form a response, before he could even move, her composure shattered. A sob tore from her throat, a sound of such utter brokenness that it struck him like a physical blow. Tears streamed down her face, unchecked. She pushed her chair back violently, the legs scraping harshly against the wooden floor. With another choked cry, she fled. She ran the few steps to the bedroom corner and threw herself onto the bed, burying her face in the pillow. Ethan sat motionless, the echo of her plea still ringing in his ears. A moment later, he heard a faint, metallic click, the sound of the simple iron bolt on the door to his own room sliding into place. She had locked him out, or perhaps she had locked herself in. Ethan remained at the table for a long time, staring at the closed door as the fire popped and hissed and the storm raged on outside, a perfect mirror for the chaos that had just been unleashed within the four walls of his cabin. The sound of the bolt sliding back the next morning was as loud as a gunshot in the still, snow-muffled cabin. Ethan, who had been sitting at the table nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee for over an hour, did not look up. He had spent the night on the bearskin rug, listening to the muffled sounds of her weeping, the storm outside a pale imitation of the one raging within her. Her plea echoed in the hollows of his mind, a riddle with no answer. "Please, just touch me once," the words of a woman who recoiled from his very shadow. It made no sense, and Ethan was a man who liked things to make sense. He had busied himself since dawn with the necessary, grounding tasks of survival. He had forced a path through the snowdrift blocking the door, the cold air a welcome sting on his face. He checked on Apollo and his 2 milk cows in the lean-to. They're warm. Animal breath, fogging the air. He split a stack of firewood with a brutal, focused rhythm. Each swing of the axe a blow against his own confusion. The clean, sharp scent of pine filled his lungs. He worked until his muscles burned and his mind was blessedly empty. But the quiet that followed was soon filled again by the memory of her tear-streaked face. Her words haunted him, a ghost he could not exorcise. When Claire finally emerged, she looked like a wraith. Her face was pale and puffy, her eyes red-rimmed and shadowed with exhaustion. She kept her gaze fixed on the floorboards, her arms wrapped tightly around her middle as if holding herself together. The silence in the cabin was a living thing, heavy and suffocating. I am sorry," she whispered, her voice a fragile rasp. "For last night." Ethan finally looked at her. He gave a slow, deliberate shake of his head. "No need." His own voice was rough. He cleared his throat and gestured with his coffee cup toward the pot on the hearth. "There's coffee." She gave a small, jerky nod and shuffled to the fire, her movements timid and uncertain. He watched her pour a cup with trembling hands, spilling a little on the stone hearth. He said nothing, simply turned his gaze back to the fire, giving her the space she seemed to so desperately need. They sat in silence for a long time. Ethan knew how to be patient. He could sit for hours waiting for a deer, motionless and silent. He could wait for her. It was to be a new life, she said suddenly, her voice so soft he wondered if he had imagined it. He turned his head. She was staring into her cup as if it held all the answers in the world. "That's what he told me, my uncle." Ethan waited, his stillness an invitation. "He said Mr. Gable was a good man, a wealthy man, that he would take care of me. A bitter, humorless smile touched her lips. He said it was my duty. For the family. We had debts. She looked up at him then, her blue eyes dark with a pain so deep it seemed bottomless. It was a sale. I was the price. A cold, hard knot formed in Ethan's stomach. He had seen men trade horses with more care and consideration. Mr. Gable. That must have been the man in the fine city coat, the one lying frozen in the snow. He was older than my father, she continued, her voice gaining a thin, brittle strength. His hands were never clean. He smelled of whiskey and stale cigars. He looked at me the way a man looks at a horse he's just bought, checking its teeth. She shuddered, a violent tremor that shook her entire frame. We were married by a traveling preacher an hour before the stagecoach left. He put the ring on my finger so tight it hurt. He said it was so I would never forget who I belonged to. She looked down at her bare, bruised finger. He never meant to get to the end of the journey. None of them did, except me. Ethan's hands tightened around his coffee cup. What do you mean? The ambush, she said, her eyes meeting his. They were stark with a chilling certainty. It wasn't a robbery. They didn't take anything. They were there to make sure the coach crashed. They were there to make sure he was dead. The pieces began to fall into place, forming a picture of calculated cruelty that made Ethan's blood run cold. The dead driver, the dead passenger, and the lone survivor in a wedding dress. It was a story meant to be simple, a tragic accident, a widowed bride. Why? Ethan's voice was a low growl. Why leave you alive? Claire's expression was bleak. Because a dead bride raises questions. A grieving widow is just a tragedy. I was meant to be found, helpless and heartbroken. I was meant to be taken back to my uncle, who would then be in control of my dead husband's considerable assets. It was all planned. The cold knot in Ethan's gut twisted into a white-hot coil of rage. It was a quiet fury, the kind he knew to be the most dangerous. He stood up and walked to the fireplace, bracing his hands on the stone mantel, his back to her. He stared into the flames, seeing not the dancing light but the faces of the men who would orchestrate such a thing. Who? He demanded, his voice dangerously soft. Who set it up? Give me a name. He heard her sharp intake of breath. I can't. He turned around slowly. You can't, or you won't. Please, you don't understand, she pleaded, her eyes wide with a fresh wave of fear. It was a fear directed at him, and it hit him harder than a physical blow. He's a powerful man, my uncle. He has connections everywhere. If you were to go to the law, they would not believe you. They would believe him, and he would find out I told you. He would send men, not just for me, for you, too. Let them come, Ethan said, the words like chips of ice. No, she cried, standing up so quickly her chair nearly toppled. You think you can fight them, but you don't know them. They are not honorable men. They are snakes. They would not face you in the open. They would shoot you in the back. They would burn this cabin to the ground with you inside it. I will not be the cause of your death. I have seen enough death. Her desperate refusal, born not of a desire to protect her uncle, but to protect him, doused the fire of his anger, leaving behind a bitter ash of frustration. He saw the terrible logic in her fear. He was one man, with one rifle, against a conspiracy of wealth and influence. He was nothing to them. He ran a hand through his hair, turning away from her again. He was a man of action, and she was telling him that the only action he could take would destroy them both. The feeling of helplessness was a poison in his veins. The next morning, the silence returned, heavier and more fraught than before. The storm had finally broken, but the world outside was a silent, white expanse. The snow drifted so high it would be days, maybe a week, before any roads were passable. Their prison had only grown larger. Ethan went about his morning chores, his movements stiff. When he returned to the cabin, he found it empty. A spike of pure, cold panic shot through him. He called her name. Claire? Silence. He strode to the bedroom area. The bed was empty. He scanned the small room, his heart hammering against his ribs. Then he saw her. She had collapsed on the floor near the small window, a crumpled heap of wool and pale skin. He was at her side in an instant, kneeling on the cold floorboards. He touched her forehead. She was burning with fever. Her breathing was shallow and ragged. He swore under his breath, a litany of curses directed at the world, at her uncle, at his own powerlessness. He lifted her as gently as he could. This time she was not an unconscious burden, but a fragile, frighteningly limp weight in his arms. He carried her to the bed and covered her with every blanket he owned. He spent the rest of the day tending to her. He melted snow for water, trying to get her to drink. He brewed a bitter tea from willow bark, a remedy his mother had used for fevers. He sat by her side, dipping a rag in cool water and placing it on her forehead. His large, rough hands, surprisingly gentle. She thrashed in her delirium, murmuring names he didn't know and words he couldn't understand. She wept in her sleep, silent tears that tracked paths through the grime on her cheeks. Her hands, which had been clenched so tightly before, were now limp at her sides. He found himself taking one of them in his. It felt small and frighteningly fragile. He held it, a silent, useless vigil against the fever that consumed her. He was fighting a battle he didn't know how to win, and the thought of losing terrified him in a way no blizzard or outlaw ever had. The fever broke 2 days later. Ethan was dozing in a chair he had pulled up beside the bed when he felt a faint stirring. He opened his eyes to find her watching him. Her own eyes were clear, the fever gone, leaving behind a deep, hollowed-out exhaustion. She looked at her hand, still loosely held in his. She did not pull away. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice weak. He just nodded, releasing her hand and standing up. "You need to drink." He brought her a cup of water, holding it to her lips as she drank greedily. Later, he brought a basin of warm water. "Your hands," he said, his explanation simple. He knelt by the bed and gently took her left hand, the one with the torn finger. He submerged it in the warm water, his thumb moving in slow, careful circles over her palm, cleaning away the dirt and dried blood. She watched him, her expression unreadable. For the first time, she allowed his touch without a single flinch, a silent surrender that felt more significant than any words. When he was done, he looked up at her. She met his gaze directly, her blue eyes holding his with a raw, heartbreaking sincerity. "I don't know what kindness feels like anymore," she whispered. And in that one sentence, he finally understood her plea by the firelight. She hadn't been asking for intimacy. She had been asking for proof. Proof that a man's touch could be something other than a claim, something other than a prelude to pain. She had been asking for a simple, human gesture that the world had denied her for so long she had forgotten its existence. As the snow outside continued to hold them captive, the walls inside the cabin began to come down. They started to talk, not about her uncle or the men who were surely looking for her, but about other things. He told her about the land, about the changing seasons, about the hawk that nested in the high pines every spring. She told him about growing up back east, about the books she loved to read, about the feel of a real city with cobblestone streets. One evening, as they sat by the fire, he found himself telling her about his brother, Caleb. "He was younger than me," Ethan said, his voice low, his eyes fixed on the flames. "Full of fire and wild ideas. He thought there was glory in war." He paused, the silence stretching. "He went south, joined a skirmish down by the border. They sent me a letter. Said he died bravely. Brave or not, he was just as dead." He fell silent, the old grief a familiar weight in his chest. "After that, after Ma and Pa were gone, I just wanted quiet. Came out here, built this place, the solitude. It felt safe. Bonds break, people leave." He looked over at her. "It's easier to be alone." She listened, her expression full of a deep, sorrowful understanding. A few nights later, she offered him a piece of her own broken past in return. The room was dark, save for the glow of the embers in the hearth. "My uncle," she began, her voice barely audible. "He believed a woman's will was a thing to be broken. Like a horse. He said I was disobedient, stubborn." She hugged her knees to her chest, her body tense. "He had ways of teaching lessons." Ethan said nothing, his stillness a testament to his focus. "There is a reason I was so afraid," she said, her voice trembling. "A reason a man's touch feels like a threat. He wanted to make sure I never forgot who was master." She took a deep, shuddering breath. Before Ethan could process what was happening, she stood and moved to stand in the faint light of the dying fire. Her hands went to the hem of the simple wool dress he had given her. They were shaking violently. "I need to know," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I need to know if I am ruined." With a final, desperate resolve, she lifted the hem of the dress just past her knee, exposing the pale skin of her upper thigh. There, stark and ugly against her flesh, was a scar. It was not a scar from an accident. It was the shape of a letter, an ornate P for Paxton, her uncle's name, seared into her skin, a permanent mark of ownership. She stood there, trembling in the firelight, exposed in a way that had nothing to do with nakedness. This was the source of her shame, the physical manifestation of her torment. It was the ugliest, most hidden part of her, and she was laying it bare for him to see. Her eyes, shimmering with tears, lifted to meet his. Her voice was a broken whisper, a final, desperate plea for acceptance. "Do you still want me near you?" Ethan felt the air leave his lungs. He looked from her terrified, pleading eyes to the brutal scar on her skin. He saw not a mark of ruin, but a testament to her survival. He saw the cruelty she had endured and the strength it had taken for her to be standing here now. He didn't answer with words. Words were clumsy, inadequate things. He rose from his chair and closed the distance between them in 2 slow steps. He knelt before her, his movements deliberate and full of a reverence that stunned them both. He looked at the scar, at the symbol of her pain and humiliation. Then, with a tenderness that defied the rough calluses on his skin, he reached out and gently covered the scar with his hand. His palm was warm and solid, a shield against the cold memory of the hot iron. He did not stroke or caress. He simply held his hand there, a silent, unshakable pressure. He kept his eyes on hers, and in their depths, she saw not pity, not disgust, but a fierce, protective anger on her behalf. His silence was his vow. It said, "This does not define you. This does not frighten me. You are safe here, and in the quiet, firelit cabin, surrounded by a world of white." A fragile, wounded thing between them began to heal. Outside, the world remained a thing of brutalist white and shades of gray. The snow lay in deep, silent drifts, sculpting the familiar landscape into something alien and hostile. At night, the howling of wolves echoed from the high ridges, a lonely, predatory sound that seemed to speak of the land's utter indifference to human life. The roads were gone, buried under a seemingly permanent winter, and the cabin was an island in a vast, frozen sea. Inside, however, a fragile spring was taking root. The fire in the hearth burned with a steady, comforting warmth, and it was not the only flame being kindled. The space between Ethan and Claire, once a chasm of silence and fear, had begun to shrink. It happened not in grand pronouncements, but in small, incremental shifts, as quiet and gradual as a winter thaw. They developed a rhythm, a domestic pattern that was foreign to them both. He would rise before the sun, his movements quiet so as not to wake her, and stoke the embers of the fire back to life. She would wake to the smell of coffee and bacon, and she would no longer stay huddled in the bed until he left the cabin. She would join him at the small table, her hair combed, her eyes less haunted than they had been. They ate their meals together, the silence now comfortable, punctuated by the simple sounds of living, the clink of a fork, the sip of coffee, the crackle of the fire. She no longer locked the door to the bedroom. The faint click of the bolt sliding home had been replaced by the soft creak of the door left slightly ajar, a silent offering of trust that Ethan acknowledged with a quiet gratitude he did not know how to voice. Sometimes, when the wind was particularly fierce and the cabin seemed to shrink under its assault, she would bring her blanket and sleep on the floor on the other side of the hearth, not far from his own spot on the bearskin rug. They would lie there in the flickering darkness, two solitary souls finding a strange comfort in their shared proximity, the fire a silent guardian between them. They shared stories like carefully hoarded currency. He told her of trapping beaver in the high country, of the time he'd faced down a mountain lion that had cornered one of his cows, of the simple, profound peace of watching the stars in a summer sky. She spoke of her mother, who had loved flowers and had taught her the names of all the constellations. She described the bustling markets of the eastern city where she'd grown up, the cacophony of sounds and smells a world away from the profound silence of his mountains. They were mapping the landscapes of their pasts, tentatively exploring the terrain of each other's lives. But their fragile peace was a candle flame in a drafty room, vulnerable to the slightest disturbance. And the disturbance came on a day when the sun finally broke through the clouds, its light a harsh, blinding glare on the endless snow. Ethan was outside, clearing a new path to the woodshed. When he heard the sound, it was the rhythmic crunch of a horse's hooves in deep snow, slow and deliberate. It was not the sound of a neighbor. He had no neighbors close enough to visit in these conditions. He straightened up, the axe held loosely in his hand. His eyes narrowed against the glare. A lone rider was making his way up the trail toward the cabin. The man was a stranger, broad-shouldered and wrapped in a thick buffalo coat. The horse he rode was a powerful black gelding, a fine animal, too fine for a simple drifter. Ethan's instincts, honed by years of solitude and self-reliance, went on high alert. He felt a cold prickle on the back of his neck. This was trouble. He stood his ground, not moving toward the man, forcing the visitor to approach him. The rider drew his horse to a halt a dozen yards away, his eyes sweeping over the cabin, the lean-to, and finally settling on Ethan. They were cold, flat eyes, the color of slate. Looking for shelter?" Ethan's voice was even, betraying none of the tension coiling in his gut. The man offered a thin, mirthless smile. "Not exactly. Looking for something that was lost. Stagecoach out of Rock Creek went missing in the storm about a week back. Supposed to be a man and his new bride on board. Found the wreck yesterday. No sign of the woman." Ethan did not blink. He kept his expression neutral, his posture relaxed, but the hand holding the axe was ready. "That's so. Haven't seen a soul out here. Storm was a bad one." The rider's gaze was sharp, probing. "Heard tell you live alone, just you in the mountains. A man sees things out here, hears things. You sure you ain't seen a woman? Young? Pretty? Maybe in a state of some distress?" Inside the cabin, Claire had heard the horse. She was standing by the window, hidden by the curtain, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She saw the man, saw the way he sat his horse, the casual arrogance in his posture. He was one of them. She knew it with a certainty that turned her blood to ice. "Like I said," Ethan repeated, his voice dropping a fraction, taking on a hard, definitive edge. "Haven't seen anyone." He had lied. The lie was smooth, instantaneous, a shield thrown up without a moment's hesitation. He had chosen a side. He had chosen her. The rider stared at him for a long, silent moment, the only sound the huffing of his horse's breath in the frigid air. He seemed to be weighing Ethan, measuring his resolve. Finally, he gathered his reins. "Well, if you do, there are folks who are very interested in her safe return, a grieving family." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "The ones who want her, they won't ask twice." The threat was unmistakable. delivered with the same casual air as a comment about the weather. Without another word, the man turned his horse and began the slow, laborious ride back down the trail, leaving behind a silence that was more menacing than his words. Ethan watched until the rider was a small, dark speck against the snow. Only then did he allow himself to breathe. He turned and walked back to the cabin, his face set like stone. He found Claire huddled by the cold hearth, her arms wrapped around her knees, shivering uncontrollably. The fire had nearly died out.
"He's one of them?"
she whispered, not looking at him.
"He works for my uncle."
Ethan went to the hearth, added a log to the embers, and stoked them back to life. He did not speak until the flames were licking at the fresh wood. "You need to tell me everything," he said, his back still to her. "Not pieces, all of it." She took a ragged breath, and the story poured out of her, a torrent of poison that had been held back for too long. "My uncle, Alistair Paxton, he is not just a man in debt," she began, her voice low and trembling. "He is a purveyor of flesh. He finds families with beautiful daughters and financial troubles. He makes them an offer, presenting himself as a benefactor, a matchmaker. He finds wealthy, powerful men, men with appetites, men who are too old, or too cruel, or too depraved to find a wife by conventional means. He arranges the marriages. He takes a finder's fee from the groom and a portion of the family's debt from the other side. He calls it business." Ethan turned slowly, his face a grim mask, the bruises on her shoulders, the fear in her eyes, the scar on her thigh, it all coalesced into a single, monstrous image. "Most of the girls, they are too scared to say no. Their families pressure them. They disappear into these new lives, sent far away where they have no one to turn to. They are prisoners in fine houses." She looked up at him, her eyes burning with a feverish intensity. "But Mr. Gable, the man I was married to, he was different. He was cruel, yes, but he was not a fool." He began to suspect the full scope of my uncle's enterprise. He realized it was not just a few arranged marriages. It was a network, a trafficking ring that stretched across 3 territories. He had documents, proof. He threatened to expose Alistair, to ruin him completely. She stood up and began to pace the small space in front of the fire, her movements agitated, frantic. My uncle could not allow that, so he arranged another deal. He would have Mr. Gable silenced, permanently. The ambush was the result. They were to kill him and the driver and make it look like a robbery gone wrong. I was to be the distraught survivor, the grieving widow. My uncle would then come to my rescue, and in the process, secure Gable's documents and fortune. But something went wrong. "You found me first." She stopped pacing and faced him, her body rigid with a desperate, terrifying clarity. "I am not just a witness to a single murder. Ethan, I am a witness to all of it. I know the names. I know the places. I am the only person left who can connect my uncle to Mr. Gable's death and to the suffering of all those other women. I am not a loose end. I am the entire thread that can unravel him." She took a shaky step closer to him, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "So you see, I am not a bride. I was never a bride. That dress was a costume for a lie. I am not a widow. I do not grieve the man who bought me. I am not anything. I am a ghost, a liability." Her voice broke, her composure finally shattering. "I am not anything at all, unless you believe me." The plea struck him with the force of a physical blow. It was a plea for more than just credence. It was a plea for her very existence. He had seen the proof of her story written on her own skin. He had heard the truth in the terror that roughened her voice. He closed the distance between them, his gaze unwavering. "I believe you, Claire." Tears welled in her eyes, tears of relief so profound they seemed to drain the last of her strength. "But you cannot protect me," she whispered, a statement of bleak fact. "No one can. They will not stop. That man today was just the first. There will be others. There will be more than one next time." They will not leave you alive, either. I won't let them take you, he said, the words a low, guttural promise. It was a vow made against impossible odds, a foolish, reckless declaration from a man who had spent a decade avoiding any and all attachments. But he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he meant it. He would stand between her and the entire world if he had to. That night, the tension in the cabin was a palpable thing. The threat was no longer a distant memory. It was a living presence, a shadow waiting just outside the door. They ate their dinner in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Every creak of the logs, every moan of the wind, sounded like the approach of footsteps in the snow. Fear was a cold, sharp knife, pressing against both of their throats. Later, as the fire burned down to glowing embers, they sat on opposite sides of the hearth, wrapped in a silence that was different from all the silences that had come before. It was a silence charged with fear, with desperation, and with a new, terrifying awareness of each other. He was no longer just her rescuer, and she was no longer just a victim he had found. They were allies in a war they were destined to lose. The candlelight cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. Claire's face was a study in conflict, her eyes fixed on the flames but seeing something else entirely. Ethan watched her, his heart aching with a fierce, protective instinct that was so powerful it almost suffocated him. Slowly, as if in a trance, she stood up and came to him. She knelt on the bearskin rug in front of his chair, her movements fluid and deliberate. She was trembling, a fine, violent tremor that he could see even in the dim light. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and dark, reflecting the flickering light of the embers. She reached out a shaking hand, her fingers hesitating just inches from his face. It was a mirror of her plea from that first night. But this time, it was different. This was not a plea for a simple touch of kindness. This was something more raw, more elemental. This was a plea for life, for feeling, for a moment of defiant existence in the face of the void that was waiting for her. This time, he did not pull away. He met her halfway, leaning forward and capturing her trembling hand in his. Her skin was cold. He brought her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle, warm kiss to her knuckles. It was an act of profound tenderness, an answer to a question she had not dared to ask. A choked sob escaped her lips. She leaned into him, her forehead coming to rest against his chest. He could feel the frantic beating of her heart, a terrified bird trapped in a cage of ribs. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her onto his lap, holding her as if she were the most precious, fragile thing in the world. There, in the dying light of the fire, their bodies met in a desperate, silent communion. It was not an act of love, for they did not have the words for such a thing. It was not an act of passion, for their fear was too great. It was a collision of two solitudes, a frantic, trembling search for affirmation. His hands moved over her back, feeling the sharp line of her spine, the fragile strength in her shoulders. Her fingers curled into the rough fabric of his shirt, holding on as if he were the only solid thing in a world that was dissolving around her. Their breaths mingled, short and shallow. Their lips met in a kiss that was not soft or romantic, but searching and desperate, tasting of salt and fear. It was a confirmation that they were here, that they were alive, that for this one stolen moment, the wolves outside could not reach them. Afterward, she wept, not the violent, hysterical sobs of before, but a quiet, exhausted weeping that shook her entire body. She lay curled in his arms, her face buried in his shoulder, and he held her. He stroked her hair, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle. He murmured her name, the sound a low, steady anchor in the dark. When her tears finally subsided, she stirred, lifting her head to look at him. Her face was tear-streaked and vulnerable in the faint, red glow of the embers.
I just wanted to feel like I was worth saving,
she whispered, her voice raw with a confession that laid her soul bare. He looked down at her, at the woman who had crashed into his life and overturned the quiet solitude he had so carefully constructed. He saw not a liability, not a ghost, but a woman of incredible, heartbreaking strength. He saw someone who had given him a reason to fight for something other than his own survival. He tightened his arms around her, holding her gently but firmly, a silent promise against the encroaching darkness. "You are," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name.
I just didn't know how much until now.
The dawn broke cold and unforgiving, painting the snow-covered landscape in pale shades of blue and rose. Inside the cabin, the embers in the hearth had died, leaving a chill in the air that had nothing to do with the morning temperature. A fragile, unspoken intimacy hung between them, as delicate and beautiful as a spider's web frosted with ice, and just as easily broken. Claire was asleep, curled on the bearskin rug where he had held her, her face softer in repose, the lines of fear and sorrow momentarily erased. Ethan watched her for a long moment, a fierce, aching tenderness rising in his chest. It was a dangerous feeling, a vulnerability he had not allowed himself in a decade. He rose silently, his body stiff. The world outside, the one that had sent the rider, had not gone away. It had simply waited for the sun to rise. He pulled on his boots and coat and stepped out into the biting cold. The air was still, the sky a vast, clear canvas, and on the fresh powder of snow, near the edge of the tree line, he saw them. Tracks. Not the clean, deep impressions of the rider from the day before, but a series of scuffed, disturbed patches of snow. Someone had been there during the night. Not one person, but two, maybe three. They had not approached the cabin directly, but had moved along the perimeter, scouting, watching. They had been careful, staying within the cover of the pines, but in their caution, they had left signs a man like Ethan could read as clearly as words on a page. A broken twig, a patch of snow melted by the brief heat of a boot. They were close. The wolves were circling. A cold dread, sharp and absolute, settled in his stomach. The fragile peace of the night was shattered. He went back inside, his movements now urgent. He closed the door with a quiet finality that woke Claire instantly. She sat up, clutching the blanket to her chest, the fear returning to her eyes as she saw the grim set of his jaw. "They were here," he said, his voice low and flat. There was no need to explain who they were. "They were watching the cabin last night. We have to leave, now." Panic flared in her eyes, but she suppressed it, replaced by a hard, brittle resolve. She nodded, throwing off the blanket and rising to her feet.
Where do we go?
"There's a mining town, northwest of here, Silver Creek. It's a hard ride, 3 days if the weather holds. It's a rough place, but I know a man there. Jedediah. He's a blacksmith. He owes me a favor. He can hide you, give us time to think." She began gathering the few things they had. He watched her for a moment as she folded the wool blankets with quick, efficient movements. Her hands were steady. She was no longer the trembling, broken creature he had pulled from the snow.
"I will not run forever, Ethan,"
she said, her back to him, her voice quiet but firm.
"After this, after we are safe, I will not spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder.
I will find a way to make him pay for what he has done." He felt a surge of pride, sharp and unexpected. "First, we live to see another day," he replied, turning to his own preparations. He packed jerky, hardtack, and a small bag of coffee into a saddlebag. He checked his Colt, reloading the empty chamber, and then took the Winchester rifle from its pegs above the mantel. He filled his pockets with cartridges until they bulged. He was leaving behind the home he had built, the quiet life he had cultivated, and he felt not a pang of regret. It was just a place. She was a life. They worked in silence, a seamless partnership born of necessity. He saddled Apollo, securing the saddlebags and a bedroll. He left the cows in the lean-to with enough hay and a broken path to the creek. They would survive. He hoped he and Claire would do the same. He helped her onto the horse, his hands firm on her waist, and then swung up behind her, settling into the saddle. He wrapped one arm around her middle, pulling her close against his chest for warmth and security. With his other hand, he took the reins, the Winchester resting across his thighs. He took one last look at the small log cabin, a lonely, silent shape against the vast wilderness. Then he nudged Apollo into a steady walk, heading for the high canyon pass that was their only way out. They rode for hours, the silence broken only by the rhythmic crunch of Apollo's hooves and the whisper of the wind through the pines. The sun climbed higher, a cold, distant disk in the sky. The landscape was beautiful and deadly, a panorama of snow-laden trees, frozen waterfalls, and jagged, granite peaks. Ethan's eyes were constantly moving, scanning the ridges, the shadows, the places where danger could hide. He could feel the tension in Claire's body, her back ramrod straight against his chest. The entrance to the pass was a narrow slash between two towering cliffs of rock and ice. It was a natural bottleneck, a place that made Ethan's skin crawl. It was the perfect spot for an ambush. "Hold tight," he murmured, his voice a low rumble against her ear. He urged Apollo forward, into the shadows of the canyon. The walls rose steeply on either side, blocking out the sun. The wind howled through the narrow opening, a mournful, eerie sound. They were halfway through when the world exploded. A glint of light from a high ledge, the sun reflecting off a rifle barrel. A split second later, the sharp crack of the shot echoed through the canyon, and a chip of rock exploded from the cliff wall just inches from Ethan's head. "Get down," he yelled, pulling Claire forward until she was bent low over the horse's neck. He drew his Colt, his body shielding hers as he scanned the cliffs. Another shot rang out, this one from the other side. They were caught in a crossfire. A searing pain tore through his left side, just above his hip, and he grunted, the impact stealing his breath. He saw a puff of smoke from behind a cluster of boulders 100 yards ahead. There were two of them. The man from the day before was not with them. These were strangers, their faces hard and grim. They were not here to ask questions. Apollo, spooked by the gunfire, reared up, screaming. Ethan fought to control the terrified animal while firing back at the boulders. He squeezed off 2 shots, the sound of the Colt deafening in the enclosed space. One of the men cried out and staggered back, clutching his chest, before collapsing into the snow. The other man ducked for cover, firing wildly. Ethan spurred the horse, forcing the panicked animal forward, deeper into the canyon. It was their only hope. "We have to get out of the pass," he shouted over the ringing in his ears. But another bullet found its mark. It struck Apollo in the neck. The great horse faltered, stumbled, and then went down with a terrible, shuddering cry, throwing both of them into a deep snowdrift. The impact knocked the wind out of Ethan. For a moment, the world was a dizzying blur of white and gray. He pushed himself up, his side a blazing inferno of pain. Claire was on her hands and knees beside him, her face pale with shock but her eyes clear and focused. "Are you hurt?" she cried, her voice thin against the wind. "I'm hit," he grunted, forcing himself to his feet. "We have to move, now!" He grabbed the Winchester from where it had fallen, levering another round into the chamber. The second gunman was moving, clambering down the rocks to get a better angle. Ethan fired, the bullet whining off the rock near the man's head, forcing him back into cover. "This way!" Ethan grabbed Claire's arm, pulling her along. He stumbled, his vision swimming, the snow around his boots already stained with a growing patch of crimson. They were exposed, trapped. He fired again, providing cover as he pushed her toward a narrow fissure in the canyon wall, a dark crevice he had spotted moments before. "Get in there," he commanded. She scrambled into the dark opening. He turned, raised the rifle one more time, and fired his last shot at their attacker. He saw the man flinch and duck away. It would not hold him for long. Ethan staggered back, falling into the crevice just as another bullet ricocheted off the rock where he had been standing. Darkness enveloped them. The fissure was deeper than it looked, opening into a small, sheltered cave. It smelled of damp earth and animal musk. It was an old shepherd's shelter or a wolf's den. It was safety. He collapsed against the wall, sliding to the ground, the rifle clattering from his numb fingers. The pain in his side was a living thing, a hot, vicious beast with claws and teeth. He pressed a hand to the wound and it came away slick and dark with blood. Too much blood. Claire was at his side instantly, her face a pale oval in the gloom. "Ethan!" Her voice was tight with terror. It's all right," he gasped, his words a lie. He was already feeling lightheaded, a cold sweat breaking out on his brow. She did not panic. The fear was in her eyes, but her hands were steady, with a determination that awed him. She ripped the bottom of the simple wool dress she wore into long strips. She pushed his hand away from the wound, her touch surprisingly firm. "Let me see." She tore his shirt open. The bullet had gone clean through, a nasty, ragged hole in his side that was bleeding profusely. "We have to stop the bleeding," she said, her voice a low, focused murmur, more to herself than to him. She folded one of the strips of cloth into a thick pad and pressed it hard against the wound. He cried out, a sharp, involuntary sound. "I'm sorry," she whispered, but she did not lessen the pressure. "I have to—" She worked with a desperate efficiency, binding the makeshift bandage tightly around his torso with another strip of cloth. For the next few days, the cave was their world. It was a cramped, cold prison. But it was a haven. The gunman did not find them. Perhaps he thought they were dead. Or perhaps the coming darkness and the threat of another snowstorm drove him away. Claire tended to him with a tireless devotion. She ventured out of the cave only once, under the cover of darkness, to retrieve their saddlebags from the dead horse, and to fill their canteens with snow to melt for water. She found the bag of jerky and hardtack, a meager supply that she knew would have to last them. Ethan drifted in and out of consciousness, caught in the grip of a raging fever. In his delirium, he saw his brother's face, heard the sound of distant battles, but through it all, he was aware of her. He felt her cool hand on his forehead. He heard her voice, a soft, soothing whisper in the darkness. She was his anchor to the living world. On the third day, his fever broke. He woke to find her dozing by his side, her head resting on her knees. She looked exhausted, her face smudged with dirt, dark circles under her eyes. But to him, she had never been more beautiful. He stirred, and her eyes fluttered open. A small, relieved smile touched her lips when she saw him looking at her. "You're back," she whispered. "You saved my life," he said, his voice a dry, hoarse rasp. "We saved each other," she corrected softly. She gave him a sip of water from the canteen. It was cold and clean, the most wonderful thing he had ever tasted. In the forced intimacy of the cave, with the threat of death just outside the entrance, the last of their barriers crumbled away. They spoke in low tones, their words weaving a bond stronger than steel. She began to dream of a life beyond the next sunrise, a life where the name Alistair Paxton was just a scar, not an open wound. She imagined a small house, a garden, the sound of Ethan's steady breathing beside her in the night. The dreams were fragile, foolish things, but they kept the darkness at bay. That evening, as the last of the light faded from the sky, Ethan looked at her, his eyes clear and full of an emotion that made her heart ache. "When my brother died," he said, his voice weak but steady, "something inside me died. Too, I came out here to be alone. I figured if I didn't care about anything, I couldn't lose anything else. I was just waiting. For the end." He reached out, his hand finding hers in the gloom, his fingers lacing with hers. "You gave me something to live for again. Claire." Tears welled in her eyes, hot and silent. She leaned over and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to his cheek, his skin rough with stubble. She felt the warmth of his life, the fragile, precious beat of his pulse. "And you," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears, her lips brushing against his ear. "Gave me someone to die beside, if it came to that." It was the most honest, most profound vow she could imagine. They stayed in the cave for 2 more days, until Ethan had regained some of his strength. The journey to Silver Creek was a waking nightmare. His wound throbbed with every step, and he had to lean heavily on her for support. They trudged through deep snow, their progress painfully slow, the wind a constant, biting whip against their faces. They rationed the last of their food, their hunger a dull, persistent ache in their bellies. But they moved forward, driven by a shared, desperate will to survive. They finally stumbled into Silver Creek on the verge of collapse. It was not a welcoming sight. The town was a chaotic collection of muddy streets, rough-hewn saloons, and ramshackle miners' tents, all clinging to the side of a mountain. The air was thick with the smoke of coal fires and the clamor of the stamp mill. Men with hard, suspicious eyes watched them as they limped down the main street. They found Jedediah's blacksmith shop at the edge of town, the rhythmic clang of a hammer on an anvil a beacon of hope. Jedediah was a mountain of a man with a wild gray beard and arms as thick as tree limbs. He took one look at Ethan's pale face and the bloody bandage peeking from his coat and ushered them inside without a word, bolting the door behind them. But their safety was an illusion, a fleeting moment of relief before the world crashed in again. They had been in town for less than an hour, with Ethan resting on a cot in the back room while Jedediah went for a doctor he trusted. When the front door of the smithy burst open, a man in a dusty coat with a tarnished deputy's star pinned to it strode in, 2 other grim-faced men behind him. He had a smug, cruel smile on his face. Well, look what we have here," the deputy sneered, his eyes locking on Claire. "Alistair Paxton sends his regards. He's very worried about his dear, widowed niece. He asked me to escort you home." Claire's blood ran cold. He was paid for, another one of her uncle's puppets. "She's not going anywhere with you," Ethan snarled, pushing himself into a sitting position, his hand reaching for the Colt that was no longer there. The deputy laughed. "She doesn't have a choice. And you, friend, are under arrest for harboring a fugitive." He took a step toward Claire, his hand outstretched to grab her arm. "Come along quietly now, missy." But the woman he reached for was not the same one who had trembled in a ruined wedding dress. The terror was still there, a cold knot of ice in her stomach, but it was now overlaid with a diamond-hard layer of rage. As the deputy's fingers closed around her arm, she moved. In one fluid motion, she pulled a small skinning knife, one Ethan had given her in the cave, telling her to keep it hidden, from her sleeve and thrust it upward, driving the sharp point deep into the fleshy part of the deputy's forearm. He howled in pain and fury, stumbling back, his hand clamping over the wound, blood welling between his fingers. The 2 men with him drew their pistols. The blacksmith shop erupted into chaos. Townsfolk, drawn by the commotion, began to gather at the door. In the confusion, they overpowered Ethan, who was too weak from his wound to put up a real fight. They slammed him against a wall, binding his hands roughly behind his back. The wounded deputy, his face contorted in a mask of pain and malice, pointed a trembling, bloody finger at Claire. "She's a mad woman! Tried to kill me!" he shouted to the growing crowd. "And he's her accomplice!" The townsfolk watched, their faces a mixture of shock, suspicion, and morbid curiosity. Ethan was dragged out into the muddy street, his legs barely supporting him. Claire was seized by the other 2 men, the small, bloody knife kicked out of her reach. She did not struggle. She stood tall, her head held high, her eyes blazing with a defiant fire that promised this was not over. Their brief dream of safety had lasted less than an hour. It had ended with him in chains and her a captive. the cold, hard reality of her uncle's reach closing in around them once more. The jail cell was a cage of cold iron and colder stone. It smelled of damp earth, stale whiskey, and the metallic tang of old blood. Ethan was slumped on a narrow cot, the rough blanket doing little to ward off the chill that had settled deep in his bones. His side was a universe of pain, a constant, throbbing fire that the rough handling from the deputy's men had stoked into a fresh agony. They had ripped away Claire's makeshift bandage and slapped on a crude dressing, but he could feel the slow, warm seep of blood beginning anew. Every breath was a battle. But the physical pain was a distant thing, a dull echo compared to the sharp, keening torment in his mind. She was gone. They had dragged her away, and he had been too weak to stop them. He could still see the defiant blaze in her eyes, a fire he knew they would try to extinguish. He slammed a fist against the stone wall, a useless gesture that sent a jolt of pain up his arm and made his wound scream in protest. He was trapped, helpless. He had promised to protect her, and he had failed. The silence of the cell pressed in, amplifying the sound of his own ragged breathing and the steady drumming of rain that had begun to fall outside. In a small, windowless storage room at the back of the sheriff's office, Claire sat on an overturned crate. The door was thick, the lock heavy. This was her cage. It smelled of dust, old paper, and mice. They had left her here to await the arrival of the transport her uncle would surely send, the men who would take her back to a fate far worse than any jail cell. For the first hour, she had been numb, a cold, hollowed-out feeling replacing the fire of her rage. The reality of their situation had crashed down on her. Ethan was wounded, jailed. She was a captive. Her uncle had won. But as the minutes ticked by, the numbness gave way to something else, a cold, clear resolve. She thought of Ethan's hand covering the scar on her thigh. She thought of his voice, thick with emotion, telling her she was worth saving. She thought of the promise in his eyes before the ambush. He had fought for her. He had bled for her. He had lied for her. He had given her a glimpse of a life she had not known existed, a life where she was not property, but a person. She would not let that be for nothing. She would not be a ghost anymore. She rose and went to the door, pounding on the thick wood. "Sheriff! Sheriff! Let me speak with you." After a long moment, she heard the scrape of the bolt. The door opened a few inches, and Sheriff Miller stood there. He was an older man, his face a roadmap of weariness, his eyes holding a deep-seated reluctance to get involved. "There's nothing to talk about, miss," he said, his voice tired. "The deputy's been sent for. You'll be on your way soon enough." "I need to see him," she pleaded, her voice urgent. "The man you have in the cell. Ethan, please. Just for a moment." The sheriff sighed, running a hand over his face. He looked at her, at the torn and muddied bridal dress that was a mockery of her situation, at the desperate hope in her eyes, and he felt a flicker of pity. But pity was a luxury in a town like Silver Creek, a town that ran on the goodwill of powerful men like Alastair Paxton. "I can't do that," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "He's a prisoner, charged with assaulting a deputy and harboring a fugitive. You're a material witness being returned to your legal guardian. There's to be no contact." "He's hurt," she pressed, her voice breaking. "His wound. He needs a doctor." "He's been seen to," the sheriff said, already closing the door. "Now just you sit tight and cause no more trouble." "Please," she cried, but the door shut with a solid, final thud. The bolt slid home, plunging her back into darkness. He had denied her. The last door had been closed, and in that moment, Claire knew she would have to open one herself. She had felt for it earlier. A loose pin in the tight bun of hair she had not had a chance to properly tend to for days. With trembling fingers, she reached up and drew it free. It was a simple thing, a thin piece of worked steel, a woman's tool. She slipped it into the sleeve of her dress, her hand closing around the cool, hard shape. It was not much. It would have to be enough. As night fell, the rain turned into a deluge. A full-blown thunderstorm crashed down upon the town, the wind howling through the muddy streets, the thunder so loud it shook the small building to its foundations. Each clap of thunder was a hammer blow, each flash of lightning a stark, momentary revelation. The storm was a wild, untamed thing, and it fed the wildness that was growing in Claire's own heart. It was the cover she needed. She went to the door, her ear pressed against the wood. She could hear the muffled voices of the sheriff and the wounded deputy in the main office, raised to be heard over the storm, with the hairpin in her hand. She began to work on the lock. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic counterpoint to the drumming of the rain. Her hands shook, and the pin scraped uselessly at first. She took a deep, calming breath, remembering a story she had once read about a prisoner escaping his cell. She focused, her touch becoming more delicate, probing the simple mechanism of the lock. Tumblers, pins. She had to feel for them, to persuade them. After a lifetime of being locked in, she was finally learning how to break out. A flash of lightning lit the room, and in the ensuing boom of thunder, she felt it. A faint click, a shifting in the mechanism. She turned the pin, and the lock gave way with a soft, metallic sigh. She held her breath, waiting, but no one had heard. Slowly, she opened the door a crack. The main office was empty. A single lantern on the sheriff's desk cast a warm, flickering glow. The voices were coming from the front room, the door ajar. They were likely sharing a bottle against the storm. On the desk, next to a stack of wanted posters, lay a revolver. It was the deputy's, she realized, a Colt peacemaker, left there while he tended to his bandaged arm. It was heavy, oiled, and deadly. Her hand trembled as she picked it up. It felt impossibly heavy, a cold, alien weight in her palm. But as her fingers wrapped around the checkered grip, a strange sense of power settled over her. This was the language her uncle and his men understood. She crept from the back room, her bare feet silent on the dusty floorboards. She moved past the front office door, her body a shadow in the dim light, and made her way to the short hallway that led to the two cells. The wounded deputy, a man named Barlow, was sitting on a stool outside Ethan's cell, a bottle of whiskey in his good hand. He was a weasel of a man, with a thin, cruel mouth. He looked up, startled. As she emerged from the shadows, his eyes widened in disbelief, and then a slow, nasty grin spread across his face. "Well now, look at the little bird," he sneered, starting to get to his feet. "Decided to come out of your cage." Claire raised the revolver, holding it with both hands to steady it, and pointed it directly at his chest. The grin vanished from Barlow's face, replaced by a slack-jawed shock. "The keys," she said, her voice a low, steady command that did not tremble. "Get the keys and unlock his cell, now!" Inside the cell, Ethan had pushed himself to his feet, gripping the bars. He stared at her, at the gun in her hands, at the cold fire in her eyes, and a wave of shock, terror, and fierce, unadulterated pride washed over him. Barlow raised his good hand slowly. "Now hold on, Missy. You don't want to do this. You're in enough trouble as it is." "I have nothing to lose," she said, and the simple, devastating truth of the statement hung in the air. "Unlock the door, or I swear by the God you've forgotten that I will send you to him." She cocked the hammer. The sound was deafeningly loud in the small space. The deputy's face went pale. He saw the utter conviction in her eyes and knew she was not bluffing. Fumbling with his good hand, he took a ring of iron keys from his belt and moved to the cell door. His hands were shaking so badly it took him 3 tries to fit the key in the lock. With a grating squeal, the door swung open. At that moment, the sheriff appeared in the hallway, drawn by the sound of the hammer. He held a shotgun in his hands, but he stopped dead when he saw Claire, the revolver, and the deputy with his hands in the air. "Don't," Claire warned. shifting her aim slightly to include him. Ethan moved out of the cell, positioning himself between Claire and the two lawmen. He was weak, swaying on his feet, but he stood as a shield for her.
"Just let us walk out of here, Miller,"
Ethan said, his voice a low rasp.
"You don't want this to go any further."
The commotion had drawn a small crowd, townsfolk, seeking shelter from the storm in the saloon across the street, now stood clustered in the open doorway of the jailhouse, their faces pale and curious in the flickering lantern light. They were a silent jury, watching the drama unfold. Claire and Ethan began to back away slowly, down the hall and toward the door. The eyes of the town were on them. She saw disgust in some faces, a man with a thick beard spitting a stream of tobacco juice onto the muddy ground near her feet. But she also saw other things, in the eyes of a tired-looking woman in a faded calico dress. She saw a flicker of understanding. In the face of a young miner, she saw a grudging respect. As they reached the doorway and prepared to back out into the storm, a woman stepped out from the crowd. She was older, her face etched with the lines of a hard life, her hair pulled back in a severe gray bun. She said nothing. She simply unwrapped the thick wool cloak from her own shoulders and held it out to Claire. Claire stared at her, confused. The woman's eyes were kind. She looked at Claire's torn bridal dress, a symbol of scandal and ruin, and offered a covering. It was an act of profound, unspoken sympathy, a small gesture of solidarity in a world that had offered her nothing but cruelty. With a choked whisper of thanks, Claire took the cloak and swung it around her shoulders, the coarse wool a welcome shield against the cold rain and the colder stares. They fled into the night. Jedediah, who had seen the commotion from his smithy, had 2 horses waiting in the alleyway, saddled and ready. "Godspeed," the big man grunted, pressing a heavy skinning knife into Ethan's hand before melting back into the shadows. They mounted and rode, plunging into the heart of the storm. The thunder masked the sound of their hoofbeats as they galloped out of Silver Creek, leaving the lights and the shouting behind them. The rain was a solid, blinding curtain, plastering their hair to their faces and soaking them to the bone within minutes. They rode hard for hours, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and the town. The storm's fury began to abate, leaving a cold, steady drizzle in its wake. Ethan could feel his strength failing. The frantic escape had taken its toll, and his wound was a raw, open agony. He began to slump in the saddle, his vision blurring at the edges.
"We have to stop,"
he gasped, his voice barely audible over the wind. He reined in his horse, swaying. Claire was instantly by his side, her face a mask of concern in the gray pre-dawn light. "What is it?" "You have to go on without me," he said, his words labored. "I'm slowing you down. Claire, they'll be coming. With a fresh posse. You can make it to the territories if you ride hard. Leave me." She stared at him, her expression hardening. "No, listen to me," he insisted, his voice gaining a desperate edge. "This is our only chance, your only chance. I'll just hold them off, buy you some time." "No," she repeated, her voice fierce, absolute. She reached out and took the reins of his horse. "I did not break you out of that jail just to leave you to die on the side of a mountain. I am not leaving you. We live together, or we die together. There is no other way." He looked at her, at the woman she had become. The fear was gone from her eyes, replaced by a strength that seemed to burn from within. He had tried to save her, and in the end, she had saved him. He was too weak to argue. He simply nodded, surrendering to her will. They found shelter as the sun was rising, a weak, watery light that did little to warm the frigid air. High on a windswept ridge, half hidden by a stand of ancient, gnarled pines, were the crumbling adobe walls of an abandoned Spanish mission. It was a ruin, the roof long gone in places, but one section remained intact, offering a sanctuary from the wind and rain. They led the exhausted horses inside, into what had once been the main chapel. Claire helped Ethan dismount, his body nearly dead weight against her. She eased him to the ground, his back against a stone wall, and built a small, sputtering fire in the center of the room with the last of the dry kindling from their stolen saddlebags. The flames licked at the damp wood, casting a warm, dancing light on the crumbling walls and their two drawn, exhausted faces. She tended to his wound again, her touch gentle and sure as she cleaned it with rainwater and the last of her makeshift bandages. He watched her, his heart filled with a raw, overwhelming emotion. They were fugitives, hunted and alone, with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the weapons in their hands. And yet, in that ruined, holy place, he felt a sense of peace he had not known in years. Later, as the fire burned steadily, they sat in silence, watching the flames. The storm had passed, and through a hole in the roof, they could see the first stars beginning to appear in the bruised, twilight sky. The world was quiet again. Here, on their high ridge, they were alone, suspended between the earth and the heavens. It was Claire who finally broke the silence, her voice soft in the vast, echoing space. She looked at him, her eyes searching his in the firelight. "I don't want a hero, Ethan," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "I spent my whole life waiting for someone to ride in and save me, but that is a child's dream. Heroes are for stories." She took a shaky breath, the confession of her heart laid bare. "I just want the man who held me like I was worth something." Tears welled in Ethan's eyes, hot and unexpected. They traced paths through the grime on his cheeks. He looked at this woman, this impossible, unbreakable woman who had faced down death, stared into the eyes of evil, and walked through fire to come back for him. The isolated fortress he had built around his heart had been utterly and completely demolished. He reached out, his hand covering hers. Her fingers were cold, but they curled around his with a trusting warmth. "Then you've got him," he replied, his voice thick and raw with emotion, a vow spoken in the heart of a ruin that felt more sacred than any church. "For as long as I breathe." Their fragile peace lasted less than a day. The vow spoken in the firelight of the ruined mission was still a warm, living thing between them when the morning brought the sound of approaching horses. It was not the clumsy tread of a lost prospector or the cautious movement of a wild animal. It was the sound of men who knew how to ride, men who knew how to hunt. Ethan was on his feet in an instant, the Winchester rifle in his hands. He was weak, a cold sweat beating on his forehead, and every movement sent a fresh wave of agony through his side. But his eyes were clear and hard as flint. He moved to a gap in the crumbling adobe wall that served as a window, peering down the ridge. 3 riders. They were moving slowly, methodically, their leader pointing to the ground, then up toward the mission. A tracker. They had not been hard to follow. "They've found us," he said, his voice a low, grim statement of fact. Claire was beside him, the heavy Colt revolver in her hand. The fear was there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was a different kind of fear now. It was not the paralyzing terror of a cornered animal, but the sharp, clarifying fear of a soldier before a battle. She had something to fight for. She had someone to fight for. "How many?" she asked, her voice steady. 3, he answered. He glanced at her, at the gun held firmly in her hands. "Stay behind me. Find cover and do not show yourself unless you have to. When the shooting starts, it will be fast." He saw one of the men dismount, a hulking figure with a cruel, familiar swagger. Even at this distance, Claire recognized him. It was the man who had worked for her uncle for years, the one who carried out his dirtiest work, the one who had held her down, the one who had wielded the branding iron. Her breath caught in her throat, a ragged, sharp sound. Her knuckles turned white as she gripped the revolver. Ethan saw the look on her face. "Claire." "I know him," she whispered, her voice a mixture of ice and fire. "The one on the left, his name is Cole." The men began to spread out, making their way up the steep incline on foot, using the rocks and ancient pines for cover. They were professionals. They were coming to finish the job. "There's a section of wall that's collapsed near the back," Ethan said, his mind working quickly. "It creates a narrow passage. They'll have to come through one at a time. It's our best chance." He guided her to the spot, a bottleneck of fallen stone and adobe brick. He positioned himself behind a solid section of the remaining wall, resting the barrel of the Winchester on a pile of rubble. His hands were shaking slightly from the fever and blood loss, but his aim was true. "Don't fire until they are close," he instructed, his voice a low command. "Make every shot count. We don't have many." The wait was an eternity. The only sounds were the whisper of the wind through the broken walls and the frantic beating of their own hearts. Claire crouched behind a pile of stone, her eyes fixed on the entrance to the pass. She could feel the brand on her thigh begin to burn. A phantom pain, a memory of fire and humiliation. But beneath the pain, a cold, hard anger was taking root. She was not that helpless girl anymore. The first man appeared, moving in a low crouch, a rifle in his hands. Ethan let him get closer, let him step into the narrow passage where he had no cover. Then the Winchester roared, the sound a deafening explosion in the enclosed space. The man was thrown backward, a stunned look on his face, before he collapsed and lay still. The other two immediately opened fire, a hail of bullets thudding into the adobe walls, sending up clouds of dust and debris. Ethan ducked down, levering another round into the chamber, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He could feel the wetness spreading across his bandage. "Stay down," he yelled to Claire. He risked a glance over the rubble. The second man was trying to circle around to the side to get a better angle. Ethan fired again, the shot going wide, kicking up a spray of dirt near the man's feet. The man fired back, and this time his aim was better. A bullet struck the wall just above Ethan's head, showering him with adobe dust. Then Cole, the man Claire knew, made his move. He charged forward, straight for the opening, a large revolver in his hand, his face a mask of brutal determination. He was counting on Ethan being wounded, being slow. Ethan swung the rifle around, but he was too slow. A searing, white-hot pain exploded in his shoulder as one of Cole's bullets struck him, spinning him around and slamming him back against the wall. The Winchester clattered from his nerveless grasp. He slid to the ground, his vision tunneling, the world turning gray at the edges. Cole let out a triumphant roar, stepping over his fallen comrade and into the mission, the revolver leveled at Ethan's chest. "It's over, Cowboy," he snarled. But it was not over. From behind the pile of rubble, a figure rose. Claire. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, but the hand holding the heavy Colt was steady. She was no longer hiding. Cole froze, his cruel eyes widening in surprise as he saw her. A slow, ugly smile spread across his face. "Well, look what we have here. The little branded calf. Your uncle is going to be so pleased to have you back. We'll have to teach you another lesson about running away." He started to turn his gun toward her, but in that moment, all of Claire's fear, all of her shame, all of her pain, coalesced into a single point of pure, incandescent rage. She was not a calf, she was not his to mark, she was not a thing to be broken. She fired. Once. The heavy revolver bucked in her hands, the sound a thunderclap of retribution. The bullet struck Cole squarely in the chest. He staggered back, a look of utter disbelief on his face. He looked down at the dark, spreading stain on his shirt, then back up at her. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a gurgle of blood came out. Then he fell, his body hitting the stone floor with a heavy, final thud. The third man, hearing the shot and his leader's silence, began to retreat. But Ethan, fighting through a haze of pain, had managed to crawl to his fallen rifle. Gritting his teeth against the agony in his shoulder and his side, he pushed himself up on one elbow, raised the Winchester, and fired. The man cried out and disappeared from view. Silence. The ringing in their ears slowly subsided, replaced by the mournful cry of the wind. It was over. Claire stood trembling, the revolver still held out in front of her, smoke curling from the barrel. She stared at the body of the man who had scarred her, who had been the instrument of her uncle's cruelty. She felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a vast, hollow emptiness. The ghost of her past was finally dead, but she was left standing in a ruin, covered in its dust. Then she heard a groan. "Ethan!" She ran to him, dropping to her knees at his side. He was a mess of blood and dust, his face deathly pale. His breathing was shallow. "Ethan!" she cried, her voice breaking. "Stay with me! Please, stay with me!" His eyes fluttered open. He tried to smile. "Told you, I wouldn't let them take you." And then they heard it again, the sound of horses. Many horses, coming fast. It was the posse from Silver Creek. They were too late. Or perhaps they were just in time. Sheriff Miller was the first one through the opening, his shotgun held at the ready. He was followed by a dozen townsfolk, their faces a mixture of grim curiosity and fear. They stopped dead, taking in the scene, the two dead men in the passage, the body of Cole lying in the center of the chapel, and Claire, kneeling in a pool of blood and dust, holding a smoking revolver, cradling the head of a man who looked to be breathing his last. They saw the rifle by Ethan's side. They saw the blood, so much blood. They saw the torn bandages and the raw, angry wound in his shoulder. They saw the utter exhaustion and fierce desperation on Claire's face. And in the silence of that ruined mission, surrounded by the evidence of a brutal, life-or-death struggle, they finally saw the truth. This was not a fugitive and her accomplice. This was a woman fighting for her life, and the man who had stood by her side. Claire looked up, her gaze meeting the sheriff's. Her cloak had fallen open, revealing the tattered remnants of her bridal dress, now stained with mud, ash, and the blood of two men. Her face was streaked with dirt and tears, but her eyes held a fire that no one had seen before. Her voice, when she spoke, did not tremble. It was as clear and as hard as a shard of glass. "I want justice," she said. Weeks later, the courtroom in Carson City was suffocatingly hot. It was packed with people from all over the territory, drawn by the sensational story of the runaway bride and the bloody standoff at the mission. The town was divided. Some saw Claire as a fallen woman, a murderess. Others whispered that she was a victim, a survivor. Alistair Paxton sat at the prosecutor's table, looking every bit the respectable, concerned uncle. He was dressed in a fine tailored suit, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. He watched Claire with cold, confident eyes as she took the stand. He believed his money and influence had already bought him the outcome he desired. Claire wore a simple, plain dress of dark blue cotton, the one the woman in Silver Creek had given her. Her hair was pulled back neatly. She looked small and unassuming in the large witness box. But when she began to speak, her voice filled the silent courtroom. She told them everything. She spoke of the debts, of the forced marriage, of the cruel hands and whiskey-sour breath of Mr. Gable. She spoke of the ambush, her voice clear and steady as she described the calculated plan to make her a wealthy widow in her uncle's control. She did not weep. She did not raise her voice. She simply stated the facts, her gaze never wavering from the judge. Then, the prosecutor, a man in her uncle's pay, began his questioning, his voice dripping with condescending pity. "Miss Claire," he began, "you have endured a terrible ordeal. Is it not possible that the trauma of the crash, the grief of losing your husband, has confused you? That you have invented this elaborate conspiracy?" Claire looked not at him, but at her uncle. "There is nothing confusing about a cage, sir, whether it is made of iron bars or a wedding ring. You know when you are in one." Then she did something no one expected. She looked directly at the judge, a stern, gray-haired man named Harrison. "Your Honor," she said, her voice ringing with a powerful conviction. "Mr. Paxton did not just try to kill a man. He tried to erase a woman. He believed I was his property to sell, to trade, and to mark as his own." With a steady hand, she reached down and raised the hem of her dress, just enough to expose the scarred skin of her thigh. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Alistair Paxton's face went white with fury. "This," Claire said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying to every corner of the room, "is the brand of his ownership. This is the truth, and it is written on my skin." She lowered her dress and stood tall. She had laid her greatest shame bare, not as a victim, but as a witness. She had turned their weapon against them. The judge stared at the scar, then at the pale, sweating face of Alistair Paxton. He had seen enough. The testimony of the Silver Creek sheriff, the evidence from the mission, it all clicked into place. In the end, it took the jury less than an hour. Alistair Paxton was convicted on all charges. Ethan waited outside, on the steps of the courthouse. He was leaning on a rough-hewn wooden cane, his arm in a sling, but he was standing. He had refused to sit, refused to wait anywhere but right there, where she would see him the moment she was free. The crowd began to spill out, a murmur of voices, some angry, some satisfied. He ignored them all, his eyes fixed on the tall courthouse doors. And then, she was there. She emerged into the bright afternoon sun, head held high. Her dress was plain, her face unadorned, but she seemed to radiate a light from within. Her eyes, once haunted, were soft and clear. She saw him, and a slow, beautiful smile spread across her face. She walked to him, not with the hesitant steps of a girl, but with the confident stride of a woman who knew her own worth. She stopped in front of him and gently placed her hand on his chest, over his heart. She could feel its steady, rhythmic beat. "You said for as long as you breathe," she said, her voice soft. "Now breathe for me." He covered her hand with his, a tear he did not bother to hide, tracing a path down his weathered cheek. His breath hitched, a ragged, emotional sound. For her, for them, for the future he had never believed he would have. The spring that followed was the most beautiful Ethan had ever seen. They returned to his cabin, to the place where it had all begun. The deep snows had finally melted, revealing a carpet of green grass and a riot of wildflowers, bluebells, Indian paintbrush, and sunny, yellow daisies. The air was warm and smelled of pine and damp earth. It was a world reborn. One clear, sunny afternoon, Claire took the ruined wedding dress from the trunk where it had been stored. It was still stained with mud and dried blood, a ghost of a terrible past. She carried it outside to the clothesline Ethan had strung between two tall pines. She did not wash it. She hung it there, in the sun and the breeze, the tattered lace fluttering like a banner. It was no longer a symbol of shame or of a life that had been stolen from her. It was a flag of survival, a testament to the woman who had refused to be erased. Ethan came and stood behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. His shoulder and side still ached, but his strength was returning day by day. He rested his chin on her shoulder, and together they looked at the dress, a strange, beautiful monument to their journey. He held her as the sun began to set, painting the western sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple. On the far edge of the horizon, a bank of dark clouds was beginning to gather. A storm was coming. But this time, they were not alone. This time, they would face it together. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from to connect with fellow fans. And be sure to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.